Wow, thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you all for your hospitality today. It's really an honor to be addressing the Greater Des Moines Partnership. I'm going to be talking today about the value of authenticity, and I'm just going to get ahead of my skis a little bit while we're waiting for the slides, and to say, let's begin with the problem that we're all trying to solve for, which is that many decades after we've been hard at work on issues of diversity and inclusion, the numbers at the top remain quite grim. So at last count, 1% of Fortune 500 CEOs were Black, 8.2% were women, and 0.6% were openly LGBT. So it seems like we need a new theory or hypothesis of how to solve this problem, because whatever we've been throwing at it to date has not been working. And I want to give you a new idea today, which is not a theory of everything, but I hope is an important piece of the problem. And that hypothesis is that we often talk a very good game about diversity and inclusion, but too often we force people to choose either diversity or inclusion. So we allow people to tamp down or edit or mute their identities and be included, but only at sufferance and at the cost of doing that work. Or alternatively, we have people come in and express their fully authentic selves, but to have them risk exclusion for doing that. So that's a very long statement of the case. I want to skinny it down to one word, and that word is covering. I wrote a book on this some years ago, and I define covering there as a strategy through which an individual downplays a known stigmatized identity to blend into the mainstream. So this is the work that we do when we are outside of the dominant group in the workplace in order to make sure that we assimilate and that we can move smoothly through the organization. But I want to offer to you today that that comes at a great cost, not only to the individual, but also to the organization. So I italicized the word known here in the definition of covering in order to drive a wedge in between covering and the perhaps more familiar term passing. So when you're passing, people literally don't know that you belong to a particular group. When you're covering, people know you belong to that group, but ask you again to downplay or edit or mute that identity so that that identity is more palatable to them. Oftentimes the same behavior can be passing or covering depending on the literacy of the audience. So I'm a member of the LGBT community. When my husband and I walk down the streets in a small town in Texas where he's from, and we don't hold hands, we're covering relative to our other family members because they know that we're gay and that we're using this strategy so as to keep our own family safe in that town. But we're passing relative to strangers whom we pass by. So I use that story not to indict, this wonderful small town in Texas where we're from, but rather to say, no matter how evolved you are on this diversity and inclusion journey, there are times when you're going to have to cover. So just to elaborate on that, in the book, I disaggregate covering along 4 different axes of appearance, affiliation, advocacy, and association. So you see my weakness for alliteration here. And I hope that if I give you these definitions and examples of these kinds of covering, you'll be able to see yourself somewhere in this picture. So appearance-based covering concerns how people change their self-presentation, whether through grooming or attire or mannerisms to blend into the mainstream. So an individual with a motor function disability might use a cane rather than a wheelchair to lower the salience of their disability in their interactions with others. Affiliation-based covering concerns how people avoid behaviors widely associated with their group, often to avoid unconscious biases or stereotypes that the behavior may trigger about them. So a woman can't hide the fact that she's a woman at work, but she might avoid talking about being a mother in a way that a man would not, because she doesn't want her colleagues to think that she's less committed to work. Advocacy-based covering concerns how much we avoid sticking up for other group members. So a veteran might hear an anti-military joke in the elevator, but might not challenge it for fear of seeming too strident. And finally, association-based covering concerns how we avoid contact with other group members. So a gay person might feel completely comfortable saying he's gay in the workplace, but might refrain from bringing a same-sex partner to a client dinner because that might be seen as too gay of an action. Once you have these 4 axes of covering in your minds, I literally think that you'll see it everywhere. So to take some public figures almost at random, I want to just go through these 4 individuals from the public sphere and talk about how each of them covered on the basis of appearance. So Margaret Thatcher, when she was first standing for prime minister, was told that she sounded like a fishmonger's wife and that she needed to go into voice coaching in order to adopt a more upper class accent and to lower the timbre of her voice so that she would exude more executive presence. So this is both socioeconomic status-based covering. She was a grocer's daughter, and they said you need to sound more patrician if you want to stand for prime minister. But it was also a demand that she cover her gender, right? That they told her voice was too shrill and that she needed to lower it if she wanted to walk in the circles of power. She went into that voice coaching and emerged with a plummier, more resonant voice, and the rest is history. She became the first female prime minister. And importantly, she never complained about it. So I don't want to assume that covering is always a harm. Sometimes covering can be experienced as a form of executive coaching, and people willingly undergo it in order to get to the next level in their careers. At other times, though, we know that covering is a harm from the self-reporting of the individuals who engage in it. So Julie Chan, the news anchor, was told that she would never get the anchor job at her network because she looked too Asian, in the words of one of the producers. And this led her to get plastic surgery. And she told the plastic surgeon, I've gotten this advice at work. I need you to make my eyes look more round and more Western. And while you're at it, I want you to resculpt the contours of my face so that they look more Caucasian. So she emerged from the surgery looking as she does in this photograph. And again, the rest was history. Like Margaret Thatcher, she went on to the next stage in her career. But unlike Thatcher, she articulated this as a harm. In a searing and tearful interview a few years ago, she said, I'm still not sure if I made the right choice, because even though it led to my professional advancement, it came at too high of a personal cost because half of my extended family threatened to disown me for lacking ethnic pride. Moving now to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt used to cover his motor function disability by making sure he was only photographed from the waist up and by making sure he was seated behind a table before his cabinet entered for their meetings. I like this detail because it really nicely distinguishes passing from covering. Certainly his cabinet knew that he had polio and he was in a wheelchair, but he nevertheless thought it was useful for him to foreground his more conventionally presidential qualities, I'm white, I am male, but to put in the background his less conventionally presidential quality, I am in this wheelchair. Again, we might ask the question of what's the harm? Like Margaret Thatcher, he never complained about it. But if we broaden the aperture of a harm just a little bit, we might ask where we as a society would be if he had been more open about the fact that he could lead the United States from that wheelchair. And then last but not least, Mahatma Gandhi is the kind of one of these things that's not like the others because he was asked to cover but rejected the covering demand. As many of you know, when he was first certified as an English barrister, he used to wear the barrister's uniform of a morning suit. But as he became more involved in Indian nationalist politics, he started to wear more traditional Indian garb, as we see him here. When he'd attained global renown, he was invited back to Buckingham Palace by no less than King George V. And the king had one request of him, which is that he return in Western garb, dressed as an English barrister. And Gandhi said, in words that I'll never forget, to do that would be disrespectful to your highness because it would be artificial. So I think we all intuitively understand the value of assimilation, the notion of the melting pot, that we need to go along to get along. But I think that we need to put more of an emphasis in 2021 on the value of authenticity, because I don't think I'm the only one at this conference who feels a thrill of pride and admiration when he hears somebody saying, take me or leave me as I am. Here I stand, I can do no other. And of course, the invitation was not rescinded, and Gandhi went to England dressed as we see him here. So this is about as far as I got in that book I was talking about. And I know I wouldn't have the honor of addressing this august audience today if the project hadn't gotten a major reboot a few years ago, when the management consultancy Deloitte came to me and said, this is actually a wonderful idea for diversity and inclusion, but you're not an empiricist, and the people we work with are not going to do anything about this unless they have data. So let's collaborate. You know, we have a great people analytics team. We'll design the survey. We'll push it out even to our own clients in the Fortune 500, and we'll see what we get. And so what I'm about to present to you now is the result of that collaboration. And we've done multiple iterations of the survey, but I'm actually going to rely on the set of results that we published in a paper whose link we can circulate in the chat called Uncovering Talent. It's available on the internet for free for those of you who want to just Google it. But this is a survey of 3,129 respondents in the Fortune 500. And we asked, first of all, do you cover, right? A very simple question. 61% of respondents said that they covered along one dimension or another. That ranged from 83% of LGBT respondents to 79% of Black respondents, 66% of women, all the way down to 45% of straight white men. So I want to draw two messages from this slide. The first is that 45% statistic, because I actually found this to be a jaw-dropping statistic, because too often we treat straight white men as either the people who are going to be lionized as the folks who are going to solve the problem, or the people we demonize as the people who are creating the problem for everybody else. This 45% statistic explodes that idea and says, straight white men are not on the outside looking in on this D&I conversation. They're in the soup with the rest of us, because 45% of them, a strong plurality, are saying that they cover along one dimension or another. So the great thing about data is that you can cut it and explore it. So we immediately looked at the ways in which straight white men covered, because we were really interested in how this ostensibly most privileged cohort engaged in covering. And among the top ways in which straight white men reported covering were things like socioeconomic status, veteran status, mental health, illness or disability, religion, and age. So once you understand that nobody is immune from the covering demand, this becomes less of an us versus them project and becomes a universal project of authenticity and human flourishing. This truly is a project that lifts all boats. At the same time, and this is the other message that I would like to draw from the slide, there's a really marked contrast between the incidence of straight white male covering and the incidence of the covering engaged in by other cohorts. So I now want to contrast that 45% statistic with the 83% of LGBT individuals or the 79% of Black individuals who reported covering. So we can hold both of these realities in our heads, and we have to be able to do that, which is to say, everybody pays this tax of covering, but the tax is not assessed evenly across cohorts. Some people are working much harder on their identities alongside working their jobs in order to make it in the workplace. Now, of course, even if the incidence of covering were really high, if the impact were low, if everyone were, as I imagine Margaret Thatcher to be, saying, I do this, but it's not harmful to me, I just view it as a form of executive coaching so that I can exude more leadership gravitas, then this wouldn't really be a project. So the next battery of questions that we asked were about the impact of this covering on the people who engaged in it. And what we found was that of that 61% who reported covering, 60 to 73% said that this was somewhat to extremely detrimental to their sense of self. So we found that covering really hurt because this wasn't just any harm, this was harm that rose to a certain level, and a vast supermajority of individuals who covered said this was harmful. We then sort of anticipated that organizations would say, yes, I can see that people are covering, I can see that it hurts them, but the call is not coming from inside the house. In other words, we're an enlightened organization. We're not going to impose these covering demands on our employees. These covering demands must be coming from national culture, peer groups outside of work, family culture, but we're a good organization. We don't do that kind of nonsense, right? So we asked the question, do your leaders expect you to cover? And 53% of respondents said, yes, our leaders do expect us to cover. And of that 53%, 50% said this expectation by leaders somewhat to extremely diminish their sense of commitment to the organization. So if you're looking for where your employees are burning out of the organization, if you're looking for those leaks in the pipeline, this is a really good place to look because 50% or 53% is a really significant proportion of your workforce. What we're seeing in organization after organization is that covering demands create this culture of conformity and inauthenticity that diminishes commitment and weakens performance. Obviously, what we're trying to do is to reverse the spin of that difficulty, where fewer covering demands lead to greater psychological safety, greater authenticity, and stronger performance. I haven't used the phrase psychological safety yet, so let me define it here. It comes from the amazing Harvard Business School professor, Amy Edmondson, and she defines psychological safety as a team climate characterized by interpersonal trust and mutual respect in which people feel comfortable being themselves. In other words, psychological safety is like the breeding ground for authenticity and uncovering. And I worried a little bit that this term psych safety was a little bit soft or spongy, but the more I looked into it, I saw that study after study, whether from industry or academia, corroborated the link in between psychological safety and performance. So for example, Google did a massive study of its 180 highest performing teams, and it found that psychological safety was the highest correlate for that high performance in those teams. Now, I know the caliber of this audience, so I know that at this point, you want to kick the tires on this idea. It may seem a little bit too good to be true. It may seem that you have some skepticism, about it floating around in your heads. And I've gotten these two questions so often that I thought I would just answer them in the middle of my talk rather than waiting for the Q&A so that you could just let go of them. Right? So the question that I always get, at some point in this presentation is, are all forms of covering bad, right? So I seem to be carrying the brief for authenticity, but surely it can't be that all forms of covering, that all forms of assimilation are necessarily bad. In fact, some forms of covering might be either neutral or even beneficial to the smooth functioning of an organization. And so my answer to this, are all forms of covering bad, is an emphatic no. Not all forms of covering are bad. And to help land that plane, I want you to imagine that I came to work alongside you tomorrow and I engaged in rapidly antisocial forms of behavior. And when you said to me, Kenji, can you please knock it off? You're driving everybody around you to distraction. What if I said, well, you're asking me to cover. This is my authentic self, and I happen to be an incredibly obnoxious person, right? So you just have to live with it. This is a workplace I would propose that no one would want to work in. So it seems pretty clear that I have to answer this question, are all forms of covering bad, with a resounding no. But as many of you will have intuited, that just pushes me to the much harder question of how then do we distinguish between the good and bad forms of covering? And I have a two-word answer here, which is organizational values. So in many of the organizations that we surveyed, people said, I have to cover the fact that I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, and I experienced that as a real harm. From our perspective, this was not problematic because none of the organizations that we surveyed said that they valued the expression of political affiliation at work. So this is not one of their values of inclusion. In contrast, every single organization that we surveyed had the value of wanting to include people on the basis of gender. But every organization that we surveyed said, or had some woman reporting out of it who said, we have to cover our gender at work by, for example, not talking about our children. So we think that the second issue is problematic, whereas the first issue is not, because in the second instance, there is some kind of mismatch in between the stated organizational value and the value as it's experienced and lived on the ground. The organization is saying out of one side of its mouth, we want to include women. On the other side, it's saying to its women, you have to manage your identity in ways that men do not in order to fit in at this workplace. In the first instance, with regard to political affiliation, there's no mismatch, right? Because the organization, whatever else it's getting right or wrong, is at least not being hypocritical. It's not saying we value political affiliation, but put a lid on it when it comes to your own political affiliation in the workplace. So I hope that's helpful in sort of helping us get a little bit more nuanced about what forms of covering are problematic and when we know that they're problematic. In other words, not all forms of covering are problematic, only the forms of covering that violate organizational values are problematic. So given that most organizations that are listening today have values of inclusion around race, gender, and sexual orientation, I thought I would spin you through some case studies. So the first one on sexual orientation will let me share with you, right, covering table. So one of the cool things that I love about the survey, and Deloitte gets all the props here, is that it was not just quantitative, it was also qualitative. So as you'll see, the incidence of covering by LGBT individuals, 83%, is review, and that's on the left. What's new here is the table on the right, which looks at the 4 axes of covering: appearance, affiliation, advocacy, and association, and allows people to respond qualitatively about how they experience pressure to adjust their identities on the job in a way that makes them feel like they don't belong or that they can't be their authentic selves at work. So I'm not going to read every slide, but I thought I would just pick out representative examples from each one. Here under association, we see I never bring a +1 to work events. I also try to avoid mentoring or sponsoring only people who are LGBT. So what I like about this answer is that part of it is really specific to the cohort. I never bring a +1 to work events was something that we only saw in the LGBT cohort in our survey. But the other one, I try to avoid mentoring or sponsoring only people who belong to my own group, was something that we saw over and over and over again. And this obviously cuts off people who come from diverse backgrounds from people who might share their own life experience and who might be wonderful mentors to them, because the would-be mentors are feeling pressure not to tip over one wing and mentoring too many people of that cohort due to the association-based covering demand. Let me move on now to gender. As you'll recall, 66% of women cover along at least one axis. Here I'd like to draw out the affiliation-based covering. I pretend that being a mother is no big deal and doesn't take up much of my time to prove that I have more time to work. Now, I mentioned this example a couple of times, and that was deliberate because this is the most commonly reported affiliation-based covering demand by women. And it came up so often that I looked in the social science research because I figured that some brilliant sort of psychologist or sociologist would have said something about this. And in fact, I was right. You know, the sociologist Shelley Carell at Stanford talks about how there is a fatherhood premium and a motherhood penalty. So if two people say, I just had a kid, if I say it and my female colleague says it, radically different things will happen to us. On average, I will get a pay hike and she will get a pay cut. The reason for this, Carell says, is because different unconscious biases are triggered when a man says, I just had a kid, from when a woman says, I just had a kid. For the man, the unconscious bias that's triggered is Kenji is now a provider. We have to pay him more because otherwise he's going to leave us for a competitor because he has mouths to feed at home and he's going to be more salary sensitive now. Whereas when a woman says exactly the same thing, the unconscious bias that's triggered is this woman is now a caregiver. She's either going to get, pulled out of the workplace entirely, or she's going to be less committed to the workplace because of her caregiving responsibilities. If that weren't depressing enough, there's another follow-on study by Beatrice Aranda and Peter Glick, two psychologists, who say, is there anything that women can do to mitigate the motherhood penalty? And the answer is yes. Women can mitigate the motherhood penalty if they engage in so-called work devotional behavior, constantly talking about how much time they have to work and never talking about their children. In our terminology today, if they cover on the basis of affiliation. So what these studies show us is that these survey respondents are intuiting something very real, that it's going to be damaging to their careers if they talk about their children. And notice how this is a collective action problem, because it's not in any woman's interest to step forward and start talking about her children. So this is something that's going to require a more systemic fix on the part of management, leadership, and culture. I next want to talk about race and ethnicity. I've compressed some examples here just in the interests of time. By way of review, 79% of Black respondents reported covering, 63% of Latinx respondents said that they covered, and 61% of Asian individuals said that they covered along at least one of these axes. Again, I'll read a representative example from each one. For Black respondents, one very common one was, I make a concerted effort not to be seen around other African-American individuals because I've seen the labels placed on those individuals when they associate with each other. That was a depressing and intriguing response, so we dug more deeply in the data. And we found people saying, when more than 2 or 3 of us gather around the water cooler, someone will walk by and say, is this a Black Lives Matter protest? Are you starting a revolution? Is this an NAACP meeting? So 3 white men talking to each other is just a conversation. 3 Black men talking to each other is suddenly something very different. And you only need to hear so many of those comments before you start thinking twice about having that conversation, about sitting next to your Black colleague in a meeting, about going to the cafeteria or out to lunch with another Black colleague, or even joining an affinity group. With regard to Latinx or Hispanic individuals, there are times when people crack jokes about being on Hispanic time, and I go along with it so I don't seem like a drag. This particular instance of advocacy-based covering was specific to the Hispanic community, but jokes in general were something that we saw over and over again with regard to advocacy-based covering. And you can see why that would be, because jokes present such a hard dilemma for the individuals who are the targets of those jokes, because if you overreact, then you will be seen as thin-skinned or hypersensitive or humorless. But if you underreact, then you feel like you haven't stuck up for yourself or for your group, and you're forced to walk around for the rest of the day, if not longer, feeling ashamed of yourself for not having done that. And then finally, affiliation-based covering. This is the Asian American example. I try to stay away from work that's stereotypical of Asians, for example, math, right? So for those of you who are listening today who are in financial services, I know some of you are, or in the tech industry, I'm sure this sends a shiver down your spine, because imagine the great quant person or the future Fields Prize winner who's in college saying, I'm really passionate about math, but I want to avoid the ethnic stereotype of being the next Asian American who's interested in math. And so I'm going to major in comparative literature instead. Obviously, nothing wrong with majoring in comparative literature, right? If that's your passion. What I'm objecting to here is that this individual felt forced not to pursue their passions simply because they were worried about fulfilling an ethnic stereotype. So think of how much talent we're cutting off, not just from that individual in terms of their own career, but also from organizations who could really benefit from those skills. Last but not least, I want to look at this 45% of straight white men who cover. I think I could go pretty quickly here because I've talked already about the ways in which straight white men cover. Appearance, I color my hair to hide gray and look younger. Affiliation, I avoid any references or hints to my mental illness so that people don't over-ascribe attributes to my illness. Advocacy, I'm a conservative Christian and feel strongly that it would be detrimental to my career to make my opinions known. And then last but not least, and really interestingly, no qualitative responses pertaining to association-based covering. So I hope you see that in general, I'm a bridger. I like to see sort of commonalities and build bridges among groups, right? But when the bridge is too far, I hope that I'm a strong enough and honest enough researcher to admit that. And here, this is the only open text box in our entire survey. And I think that we have to infer from that straight white men are indeed dissimilarly situated from other groups with regard to not being subjected to the association-based covering demand with the same intensity. In other words, straight white men will find it much easier to swim through organizations without being worried about hanging out too much with other straight white men, whereas every other cohort that we studied is intensely worried about tipping over too much into hanging out only with members of their own group. Now, we're almost at the Q&A, so I hope you're gearing up to ask some questions. I always hate it though when academics give these really elegant analyses of problems and then run off the stage without offering a single constructive piece of advice. And so I want to give you 3 takeaways here that you can implement immediately after listening to this talk. So the first one is diagnose covering demands. The second one is share your story. And the third one is be an ally. So with regard to diagnosing covering demands, this is really just the work that you do on yourself to figure out whether and how to challenge covering demands in your own life. So it's a kind of flowchart analysis of questions. So the first thing that you want to ask yourself is, do you cover along the 4 axes of appearance, affiliation, advocacy, and association? If so, is that form of covering harmful to you? If the answer to this is no, I cover, but it doesn't hurt me, then you're like, again, as I imagine Margaret Thatcher to be, and no further action is required. But if you cover and it's harmful to you, we want you to go to the next question and ask, is the covering inconsistent with the value my organization holds at a higher level? So again, to take the example of political affiliation, if I say, oh, I'm a Republican and I have to cover that and that's hurtful to me, but the organization doesn't say we have a value in you expressing your political affiliation. In fact, we have a value in not having those contentious debates at work, right? Then I'm kind of out of luck, right? I can either persuade the organization to change its value, I can leave the organization, or I can remain loyal to the organization and just cover and take that as the cost of remaining in the organization. But there are times when you cover, it's harmful, and it does violate one of the values of the organization, as we saw in the tables that we looked at above. And if that's the case, then we encourage you to challenge your organization to live up to its values. And this actually is not as hard as it would seem, because the organization has already stated at a higher level of generality that it believes in inclusion on the basis of race or gender or sexual orientation. And you're not asking the organization to change its values. You're just trying to help the organization live up to those values rather than simply under them. The second strategy is share your story, and this is fairly intuitive. Both Deloitte and now Microsoft, whom we have also worked with, and when I say we, I mean my center here at NYU for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, have adopted some version of share your story. So what we encourage you to do, particularly if you're a leader in an organization, is to think of a personal story consistent with the firm's values of inclusion, make any necessary adjustments for a professional context, and then consider sharing that story when introducing yourself to an internal or external audience. This has proven to be incredibly effective. Deloitte actually did a video project where it released videos of its top 60 leaders, and the organization, the day after those videos dropped, felt much smaller and much warmer than it had beforehand, because these leaders were talking about all the different ways, right, in which they wanted to share their stories of being authentic and uncovering in the workplace, and they created that psychological safety in the organization for others to follow. Last but not least, be an ally. This is a whole separate tranche of my research, so I'm actually going to do this very lightly here because we just don't have time to do it all. But this is work that we've done in collaboration with Microsoft, and we came up with something called the empathy triangle, which we think is a general solution to D&I issues, but is also a particular solution to covering demands. So the triangle piece of the empathy triangle has to do with the fact that every allyship relationship has three people in it. There's the ally, there's the affected person, here the person who's targeted by the covering demand, and then the source of non-inclusive behavior. So what we're imagining here is either kind of, I saw it, the ally, it happened to me, the affected person, or I did it, the source. And the empathy part of the empathy triangle is we want you to ask these questions, which I'm not going to have time to drill into, of each kind of point on the empathy triangle to make sure that you're exhibiting the proper best practices for allyship, right? With regard to covering, let's go back to the actual example from the survey of, the affected person walks in late for a meeting, they're Hispanic. The source says, oh, I see you're on Hispanic time. How do you as the ally react? Well, the first thing to note is that you as the ally, all the social science demonstrates this, are going to be much more effective in confronting the source about that covering demand than the affected person is himself or herself. However, we want you to be mindful and careful about the way in which you intervene, because too often the ally goes barreling in and says something like, I can't believe you said that. Can you imagine how our colleague Nicholas must have felt when he heard that comment? Microaggressions are directed at racial and ethnic minorities all the time, and I would ask you to retire that comment, apologize, and never do that again. So if I barrel in that way, it's not only that I've unnecessarily humiliated the source, who might have actually simply been oblivious to the fact that his joke was offensive, but I also may have embarrassed the affected person because I'm not even sure that the affected person wants help, much less the kind of help that I've given them, right? So in those circumstances, we really encourage you to talk to the affected person to say, I noticed that, I cared about it, and I would like to be your ally. Is there anything that I can do that would be helpful? If they say yes, you can strategize together about how to deal with it. If they say no, that is still a win because they banked you as an ally. So they don't need you now, but 5 minutes, 5 months, 5 years from now, they can come back to you and say, I didn't need you then, but boy, do I need you now. So think about allyship as another tool in your pocket to deal with covering demands and more broadly to deal with diversity and inclusion issues more generally. So I'm almost at Q&A, but before I do that, I've talked so much about sharing your story that I'm going to end by sharing a story of my own. And I want you to think about how you felt about me before and after I told this story, because I think oftentimes people are worried about losing authority or appearing too vulnerable when they share their stories. And I want you to think about whether or not you thought more or less of me, either as a person or as a scholar after you heard the story, because my hope is you will think more of me, both as a person and as a scholar. So the year is 2008, and I'm tenured and chaired at Yale Law School. And the chair that I hold is very dear to me because it was named after the judge for whom I had clerked. However, the kind of tricky bit was that my husband and I were thinking about starting a family. We wanted to be in the same city before we did that. And he lived and worked in New York. And I was unable to convince him that New Haven was the city in which we should raise our family. I was unable to convince him that New Haven even was a city. And so I applied to 2 schools in New York, was fortunate to receive offers from both of them. And then the recruiting season began. Both of the deans began to call me. And the dean of NYU at the time, a wonderful person named Ricky Revesz, said, you know, Kenji, we know this chair that you have at Yale is really important to you. We looked in our roster to find a similar chair and couldn't find one. And so we actually took an extraordinary step of endowing a new chair. So we raised $5 million. We've created this new chair in honor of your work at the intersection of constitutional law and civil rights law. And it is the Earl Warren Professorship of Constitutional Law. And there was this long ringing silence where I was kind of sitting in my discomfort because every people-pleasing bone in my body wanted to take that chair, which had been offered with all the goodwill in the world, but I knew I couldn't do it because I had just written the book on covering, and I knew that to accept the chair would be a form of advocacy-based covering. So finally, I spoke up and I said, Ricky, I'm really sorry, but I can't take that chair. And he was astonished, and I could tell a little bit annoyed. And he said, why on earth not? I hope you understand how much work went into this. And I said, well, as you may know, I'm of Japanese descent. And as you may know, as Attorney General of California, Earl Warren superintended the internment of over 100,000 people of Japanese ancestry without any due process or criminal charges. And I just can't be honored with the name of an individual who has so dishonored my people. So Ricky immediately understood, and he said, I get it. Please don't make any sudden movements. I'll call you back in 3 days. 3 days later, he calls back and he says, I have a new chair for you. And I said, great, then lay it on me. And he said, we would now like to offer you the Chief Justice Earl Warren Professorship of Constitutional Law. And this time I was the one who was a little bit astonished and annoyed. And I said, what difference could that possibly make? You've just taken the chair I rejected 3 days ago, tacked on the words Chief Justice to the front of it, and offered it back to me as if it were a new chair. And Ricky said, no, hear me out. In the intervening days since our last conversation, I've read a biography of Earl Warren. And in that biography, Earl Warren says that the thing that he most regretted about his legal career was the internment of the Japanese. So given that your project, whether you call it civil rights or diversity and inclusion, is to take people from where they are and bring them as far along the maturity curve of understanding how many different valid ways there are to be a human being, what better title could you have than the name of an individual who began by interning the Japanese and ended as Chief Justice of the United States, writing opinions like Brown versus Board of Education and Loving versus Virginia? What better title could you have than the name of an individual who was able to grow so far over the course of a single lifetime? And I said, that chair, Ricky, I will take. And so I sit before you today as the Chief Justice, Earl Warren Professor of Constitutional Law. I thank you for your kind attention, and I welcome your questions.
Question in the chat, is that correct?
Yeah, we have a question ready to go. With regards to passing or assimilating into the workforce, has there been any research conducted on hidden disabilities like stuttering, autism, PTSD, etc.? There are some employees I know who are embarrassed to speak because they stutter, and some do not interact with others for fear that their autism could cause a problem.
Yes, and in fact, the individual who did early research on both passing and covering, Irving Goffman, the sociologist writing in the 1960s, focused heavily on the disability community and thinking about both of these phenomena. And so I would actually refer you to his work, which is titled Stigma, semicolon, and the subtitle is Notes on the, Stigma, Notes on the Management of Spoiled Identities, is I believe the subtitle. But he actually takes up issues of both passing and covering with regard to those disabilities that he mentioned there.
Your question in the room? One over.
Yes, can you hear me okay? Sorry. Just wanted to say thank you again to everybody who's been part of this conversation today, and this session's been fantastic. For Mr. Yoshino, I really resonate with your story about how the Chief Justice became part of your DNA after the second time or second attempt. Since last year, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this, you, sir, or anybody else in the room, is that in the conversations I've had at my workplace and personal life when it comes to an example of growing and turning a story into a positive, right? When we hear things about, you know, a change of a name or a school because it was in 1914 and said person didn't vote, didn't fight against injustice. And then there's been fantastic work for 90 years. When I say that, I mean like the Woodrow Wilson School of Diplomacy, for example, an attempt to try and change a name to try and mask the fact that somebody was, you know, had a different take 100 years ago. How do you, in my experience, I've had the conversations of saying, hey, you know, diversity and inclusion is also about a starting point and an end point, right? And I think if all of us lived in the 1900s or before, we would have had very similar probably mindsets on what we thought injustice was, right? And so how did you navigate through conversations today about saying, hey, there are other examples. I'm from Uganda originally. I was born in Kenya. I came to the US in 1998. And I had the fortunate ability to live in Europe because my parents were UN brats. So Germany to me is a perfect example of where, for example, anything involving the Third Reich or the Holocaust is indoctrinated into every single educational facility, primary school, high school. They cover as a topic. It's a requirement to know about the history, no matter how dark or light it is, right? So how did you ingratiate or incorporate that kind of messaging to folks who, in a sense, try to hide the history when it comes to some impartialities?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do it justice, but let me take a stab at it, right? So, you know, the first thing that I think you're noting is that these struggles occur everywhere and in every period of time. And one thing that, you know, if I can just take it as a point of privilege to say is that I actually view my work as a lawyer in civil rights and my work in diversity and inclusion to be completely contiguous with each other. So one of the things that makes me sad is that we don't look at all of you who are working in diversity and inclusion right now in this room and say to you, congratulations, thank you. You know, you're all doing this generation of civil rights work. It's a wonderful book by Frank Dobbin, a sociologist at Harvard, who talks about how the origins of diversity and inclusion come from at least in this country, come from the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So we have a really deep and honorable tradition, right, of working in civil rights. So people often say, you know, why is it that a civil rights lawyer, a constitutional lawyer is working in D&I? And I actually think that, you know, D&I began, right, or I know that D&I began in law. So I think it's more counterintuitive that D&I is simply seen as a province of something anything less than a project of civil rights. So that's one of the things that I do want to drive home. And one of the ways in which I kind of, one of my go-to points whenever I'm challenged, right, about anything that I'm trying to teach, of saying like, you know, do I think like talking about microaggressions or unconscious bias or stereotype threat or covering or anything like that, or as you say, the papering over of history, you know, is something that, you know, is important, or isn't this just kind of trivial? Don't we have more important things to do? And I say, I actually think this is some of the most important things that we can do, because these are the same faculties of conscience and compassion that we exercise when we engage in civil rights work. So that's at least where the answer would begin. It may take a longer conversation between us for me to get at the nuances of your question, but that's my best answer for now.
Is there any questions in the chat?
Yeah, I have another question to share. There's actually three, but we'll start with one. Is the demand for women about pretending that motherhood is not a big deal consistent, happening at the same rate for women across racial and or ethnic backgrounds? Or in other words, for individuals with minoritized identities and those with more than one minoritized identity, did some of the covers become less or more important because of having multiple of these identities? For example, for a gay Latinx woman, was the motherhood covering the top covering?
Beautiful. Thank you for that. So with regard to covering on the basis of gender with regard to children, Shelley Carell's research, as far as I know, didn't disaggregate these intersectional effects. Intersectionality, as I'm sure most of you know, is when more than one identity is in play. And we didn't do that ourselves. So we haven't actually looked at that data. That would be really interesting to do. But I will say that the first thing that I did in Toto, when we got the data back, was to do an intersectional analysis of all of the data. So I want to distinguish between not having an answer to that particular question, but also having an answer to the broader question of did we see intersectional effects with regard to covering across the board. So what I asked the team at Deloitte to do was to give me cuts of all covering, right? So I said, give me cuts for all covering for white men, white women, Black men, and Black women. Because what I'd been reading at the time was this really interesting debate between Kimberly Crenshaw, who talks about intersectionality as a double cloud, right? You know, that if you are a Black woman, there are kinds of discrimination that compound on you, so that the whole of discrimination is actually greater than the sum of its parts. And so it's really a much deeper effect than simply being a woman to be a Black woman. But then Catherine Phillips up at Columbia Business School said, you know, sometimes there may be canceling out effects where, you know, stereotypes about Black individuals and stereotypes about women may be so kind of contradictory with each other that you might actually be at an advantage if you're a Black woman as opposed to a white woman or a Black man. So it's like, color me skeptical on the Catherine Phillips, you know, thesis. But, you know, essentially the notion is, for example, if Black individuals are seen as more aggressive than white individuals, again, stereotypically, of course, and women are seen as more timid than men, could it be that the timidity and aggression stereotypes sort of evaporate when they collide with each other in a Black woman? So this is not a compounding thesis, it's a canceling out thesis. So I said, well, you know, this is an empirical question, it's not a theoretical question, so let's actually see what the data says. So I said, give me those 4 cuts and then give me a spider chart with the 4 axes of covering. So there's appearance, affiliation, advocacy, and association, with 0% covering at the outer rim of the chart. So a bigger diamond is a better diamond, right? Where you look at like, here are the ways in which, you know, white men cover, right? And sure enough, what we found was like the biggest diamond, you know, so the people who were covering the least were white men. White women were actually nested very tightly within white men. So it was actually a relatively small jump from white men to white women. Then there was a huge jump between white women and Black men. And then there was another smaller jump between Black men and Black women. So Black women were engaged in the most covering, and all these diamonds were nested within each other, such that Black women were doing more covering than anyone else across all 4 of those axes. So I looked at this and I thought, wow, this is a publishable result, right? Because this clearly sides with Crenshaw over Phillips and saying what we're seeing is a kind of compounding double cloud effect rather than a canceling out effect. So I don't have an answer to the specific question about whether or not women of color, you know, cover more with regard to parenting. But I do have a general answer about whether women of color cover more than white women, and that answer is absolutely yes.
Any other questions inside the room? Any on the chat?
Yes, I can add another. How does one weigh in risk and reward when one does covering? Sometimes it may be a question of just survival in a particular situation or environment. How does one address this?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, whoever posed that, because it's a really important question. Oftentimes, I think I am heard as saying, oh, you should really just have the courage of your convictions and uncover yourself because that's the only way in which you're going to have a kind of thriving career, right? And that's not what I intend to say at all. I'm actually not interested in like psychoanalyzing people who engage in covering practices. I'm much more interested in looking at covering demands made by other people and asking them to retire those demands to the extent that they're not justified by organizational values. So, if I can make a distinction between covering performances and covering demands, I'm much more interested in covering demands and focusing on those and retiring those than in challenging somebody's decision to cover or not to cover. So my answer to this notion of like, how do you actually balance the risk and reward calculus is to say, in some ways, I think that still puts the focus on the wrong person. Like, I don't want to, torture the person who's already disempowered in exchange about what the right decision is with regard to covering. I'd much rather turn to the manager of that person and the leaders of that organization to say, look, we can document that covering demands are being made within this organization. What are you going to do about it? So that's why I say things like sharing your story or being an ally are really particularly powerful strategies because they don't rely on the individual. They reside, in the people around that individual, right? Who, for example, as leaders are sharing their own stories and creating more psychological safety so that the risks appear less and the rewards appear higher, right? And then with regard to allyship, that's all about this notion of don't blame the victim. The person who's being asked to cover is the most vulnerable person, right? So rather than asking that person to fight their own battles, as in again, reverting to the Hispanic person who's being told they're on Hispanic time, don't make that person have to challenge that joke because that person is in a really difficult position of either seeming to be oversensitive or having to, bite their tongue but feel like they didn't stick up for themselves. So if you stick up for that person as the ally who is not Hispanic, right, that actually can do a world of good, and then that person can stick up for you, on your issues on the next round.
Hey, Kenji, I do have a question that actually was text to me. After the pandemic and working from home, I heard many people of color, friends, employees saying how much working from home was helpful to them, that they felt like they didn't have to cover while working from home and how much less pressured they felt. How can organizations take this into consideration as they review their return to work plans?
Great, yeah. So I want to, at the risk of contradicting the premise of the question, right? I want to say I have heard that, but I have also heard some really important qualifications to that as well. Oftentimes people say to me, Kenji, you must be in heaven right now because everyone's remote. So everyone's inviting each other into their homes. And that's a wonderful thing because we get to see people as, three-dimensional, and this separation between work life and home life has now gone away. So this must be like, because you care so much about authenticity, this must be like a dream for you. And I often say, actually, I'm hearing a lot of other things as well that are slightly less, optimistic, right? Or sanguine with regard to this trend, because I'm hearing people saying, well, I have lost all control and all privacy, right? Because I'm at home and like on gender grounds, like I can no longer cover, the fact that I have, childcare responsibilities because my kids are running around behind me because they're in the same space as me, right? So I find it much more difficult. Or on socioeconomic status grounds, like people just not being able to cover that as interns or as first-year analysts, they're like, zooming in from, a studio apartment in Brooklyn, whereas their manager or the head of their department is like on literally, I mean, I've heard this, on a yacht, or there's a mansion behind them, or there's a pool, behind them. And it's just like the socioeconomic differences are really glaring and sort of put in your face, right? In a way that is not particularly conducive to feeling psychologically safe in the environment. So what I say is what we can learn from this is that it's not that disclosure, in itself is a good thing. Like for me, authenticity is really dependent on autonomy. It means that I control what I share and what I don't share, right? So the idea that I would kind of be forced, right, to invite somebody into my home when I don't particularly want to do that, right, for particular reasons, like kids running around behind me or having a studio apartment, when my counterpart is, zooming in from a yacht. Like maybe I don't want that, right, as part of the interaction and part of my, life story that I'm presenting to my colleague, right? So I think what we can learn from this is, we want to give people more kind of authenticity, but that doesn't mean that it's not like a necessary effect of, having people come in from their homes and zoom in from their homes that we're going to get that, because that often lacks the kind of autonomy premise, right? Sure, people can put in sort of screen filters, but oftentimes those things break down, or, children find a way. I have 2 kids myself, as you know, so, children sort of find a way to get around those filters and make their presences known, and so on and so forth. So I think what we carry away from that is it's a wonderful thing to be able to present more of a 3-dimensional picture of yourself. But that to me is more of a narrative about wanting more autonomy in how we organize our work lives. So I want the autonomy to work more from home when I'm not needed in the office. I want the autonomy to share what I want to share, right? So just because I'm working from my home doesn't mean that, you can ask me for a tour of my home as my work colleague, right? And ask me to sort of carry my laptop around to show you various views of my house, right? So I think that what this teaches us is like authenticity itself, right, is not worth that much unless it's accompanied by respect for people's autonomy as human beings about what they want to disclose and what they don't want to disclose. And that is a critical component of my vision of authenticity.